I've just realized it's the 9th year of this short series of artists' talks. I would like to thank Brett Steele for hosting them all this while. And what I want to say before I introduce Matt Saunders briefly is to remind you that there are 3 more talks in this series. The first is on the 15th of February, and it's David Clairbout. The second is Anne Lieslegaard on the 8th of March. And finally, Jonas Dahlberg from Sweden on March the 22nd. The information's on the AA website, and there is one image each as well on the website of their work. I was not familiar with Matt's work when I went up to the Liverpool Biennial, and he had just, on the very last week, when his show there had just started. And I looked at it and I knew immediately I was going to invite him. And he has very kindly broken his journey. I think it was today you were due to fly from Berlin to Boston. So he's broken his journey to be here with us, and so I count myself lucky. Matt Saunders makes pictures using techniques of the photogram, the photograph, film, and painting. But you cannot ask, does he make photograms, or photographs, or films, or paintings? He has said that he tries to make unstable forms, both cinematic in feeling and painterly. Unstable because moving a picture from one form to another is a kind of translation, his word. But it's not the kind of translation where one form dominates the other. Neither form is privileged. This is not an easy task when using words, and it is certainly no less complex a task at the level of the picture. You might also ask, what happens to Matt Saunders' relation to the original subject matter, which is of some importance to him, I think. Since this subject matter is not easily decipherable, subjected as it has been to complex processes of making. You can't say what that subject matter is, but you might have an experience of it. You will no doubt come to appreciate the complexity of his time-based processes and its effects over the next hour. Matt studied painting and printmaking at Yale. For the last dozen years, he has shown work in many places, including New York, Istanbul, San Francisco, Berlin, the Renaissance Society in Chicago in 2010, the Sharjah Biennial in 2011, and Tate Liverpool late last year. He writes for art magazines. This year he's teaching at Harvard. Please welcome Matt Saunders.
Hi. Thank you so much, first for the invitation. It was a pleasure to break my trip, and for the introduction, which is great. I don't give many talks, and I don't really know what to say to strangers often. So first of all, I want to say that please interrupt me. I have no axe to grind doing a formal talk here, and I thought that given that the invitation, as far as I understood it, was based on the show in Liverpool, this would be my thread to grasp. And what I will do is I want to show you what work was in that show, and then I tried to go back through my past 12 years of work and try to think about what lines led into that work in particular, and try to make a narrative that that explains something of these things that you see. But actually I'm very pleased to start just with the Liverpool images, because in a way, the most important thing actually is the currentness of the work. And when the interview, the conversation about unstable forms that Parveen mentioned, I'm very interested in this experience of the viewer and counting these things fresh. And so what I thought we could do first is actually just look at some of these images, and maybe I'll try to do the kind of Mary Kelly critique. I don't know, she has a legendary style of critiquing where you have to put up you have to put the thing on the wall and then take it apart piece by, basically make propositions about what it is, not what it means, and move through. So these are some pictures. This is the same picture. This is the show in Liverpool. So these are photographs. They're scaled like paintings. They're big. They have evidence of being handmade. They're gestural in a way. There are ways in which they seem to be revealing something of materials and something of process. I hope. They're often figurative. That's been a very consistent part of my work, which is shifting, I think, right now more. And they're mediated. You know, I think that I would hope that any raw experience of one of these pictures, you would get that there was some source. These are women in a kind of bathing outfit from the 30s, and they're coming from someplace. They're not coming from the present exactly. And to that I would add that they're mediated in form as well, that you have these traces of materials. There's this fabric print in this picture, but it's this fabric print inside of a photograph, and it's washing away, and so there's a sense of maybe layers of change or mediation happening there. And in a way there's an aspect of the surface that comes into that too. So a picture like this, I hope, has a feeling not just of materials, but of materials caught beneath glass, and that glass is both maybe the surface of the print, and it's also a moment in time. It's got a sort of instantaneous quality, which maybe functions in a similar way. And then, to that I would add an editorial thing and say that all of these things which have been photographs for the last little while are talking about painting, and really are growing out of painting. And I feel like I have to often insist on that. And I refer to these things as being paintings often, and in that I think that's one thing I'm very interested in, is this way that you can talk about very specific things without being bound by them. That I think it's, for me, I feel like I've arrived at this idea that I can speak more about painting as an idea through this kind of mediated version of it than being bound to sort of canvas and paint. And so what I mean by that is, in one way, painting is a genre, a kind of, a long historical series of associated moves, and your knowledge of that, and kind of accounting for a history of the medium, whether it's portraiture, whether it's history painting. It's also a set of materials. There's some changed over time, but I'm using oil, I'm using India ink, I'm using linen. And so there's a materiality of painting, and there's also a set of functions. That painting is a mark. It's a pour. It's a gesture or a suppressed gesture. And I guess now, starting to go through this series here, there's also seriality, right? So there's a seriality in process, working through an idea, working often with the same image through multiple forms. And then I'm also very interested in the seriality of experience. So there's the seriality of in the studio, and then there's the seriality of putting these things side by side, and putting them next to each other, whether they're sequences, whether they're, in this case, an inversion and a turn. And to that end, I would say there's a third aspect of painting that I think about a lot, which is like the conventions of seeing painting, the way that not just painting has a standard scale, but there are certain ways that we walk into a gallery expecting to see a picture on the wall that's a painting, and these pictures function for me often as installations. They come as bodies of work, and so I really try to think of them as kind of gallery experiences that are thinking about the experience of being in a picture gallery, very self-consciously. So that was Liverpool. Maybe we're done. I wanted to talk mostly about the work of the last 4 years, but I had two things I wanted to kind of bring up as threads going back for the 10 years prior to that. So I'm going to embarrass myself by actually showing student work, which I hope is okay, in a way to show that all of these lines of thought for me are driven by a kind of a series of dissatisfactions. It's always this thing that you hate, and then you do something else in response to that. And so it's a narrative I can describe really, really clearly. And the first thing I want to talk about is my history with painting. I moved to New York, and I was making pictures like this. I was living in the East Village and house sitting for somebody, and was going to the video store all the time trying to find images of the East Village I just wanted to research the place. And so for me, I had been an abstract painter. I had been a very earnest, finding meaning in abstraction guy in school, and then was making those paintings in the States and in New York, and watching these movies to kind of inform myself about where I was and keep myself company, and started painting from these sequences. So this is Udo Kier in the opening of Andy Warhol's Dracula. This is Holly Woodlawn from Trash. And I had this idea that what I was doing was this very private project of archaeology. I was watching these things on the TV. I was taking a Polaroid picture of moments. This is, Holly Woodlawn's a terrible drag queen. She's always scratching and touching her face through the whole film, and it was like the static over top of the narrative of the film was her constant tics, and so I was just capturing every tic, and had this idea I would just paint every time she scratched her face. I was making the paintings very quickly. This is Joe D'Alessandro, also from Trash. It's this terrific scene where he's standing naked, completely exposed, and somebody's watching him, and the camera's watching him, and he starts shaving, and it's like you see every muscle in his body relax, because this is way that he kind of gets lost in that private space inside the mirror. And so I was making these pictures that I thought were extremely intimate, and I thought that I was chasing this sort of fleeting moment and some sort of interaction with something, and I was quite earnest about it. I went to graduate school, and in the first critique I was talking about all of these ideas, and somebody cut me off and said, no, you're the gender issues person in this class. That's why you're here. You know that. And for all my earnestness, I hadn't accounted for the signs I was using. And I got very self-conscious and spent a couple of years instead making these video works that were really over the top, addressing the viewer, using basically basically trying to use these tools of kind of corporate presentation to make these texts about who I was, what I was interested in, blah, blah, blah. And then had something I wanted to paint again, which was this a film by Christoph Schlingensief, who became an artist and sadly passed away recently, but I was really interested in his films, which is where he started, and his work in the 80s where he was taking Fassbinder actors who were in total decline, who were in free fall, and casting it. So this is Udo Kier, again, in a film called Egomania, The Island Without Hope, starring Tilda Swinton and Udo Kier. And I always saw the scene as a remake of a scene with Hanna Schugula from Lily Marlene. So it was like this citation that was over-the-top camp. And I started with one still and basically made a series of paintings. I'm going to speed up a little bit. But making the same painting, making multiple paintings from one image, trying to change how those paintings were being painted, with this idea that the experience of the viewer was then going through some experience of a shifting relationship to something, a repetition of something, like this thing that happens once we get the rewind button. What is it when you live in a world where you can scroll things backwards, or you can have this relationship to an image? And that led me into pushing the materials, trying to coalesce these things into one painting. This painting is maybe almost that big, and it's painted very thickly on one part, very thinly on another part. And I was thinking about how that image could come together as an image and fall apart as an object. That the painting would be uncomfortably distant from itself internally, and then coalesce in this recognizable photographic image, which led me to paint on both sides of plastic. I had the chance to do a show in New York, and I started painting these extremely campy images, thinking also of this idea, the sort of rewind of the artificial time-space problem of film. I just set out to make a portrait of all these people I loved from films sleeping, or pretending to be asleep, or playing dead, or whatever. Only it grew out of this interest in the Warhol film Sleep, which has without having seen it as a young student, I had this idea that it was this radical conflation, of course, of cinema time and real time, and of course it's absolutely edited. It's made up of all these fragments that are put together, and it's the most artificial of all of his films, the most constructed. And so this was the show. And what I took away from this show was actually not that idea, but my excitement about these materials and how they were working together. This was the follow-up show, which was kind of about Venetian banquet painting. You know, these enormous paintings with the conceit that it's an instantaneous moment, but it takes you 10 minutes to see the whole painting. So this was a panning shot from a Fassbinder film that I spread out as the cinematic shift, you know, all the way around the room. But what was most interesting to me there still was this way of working with the mylar as a support, which suddenly was like the surface pushed inside of the material, if that makes any sense. So in a painting like this, she's on the front, he's on the back, and that point of contact is through that screen that's between them. It's a totally literal, I mean, I said I was going to embarrass myself, so here we are. But it was this line of thought of coming to an idea that all of my earlier sort of naive ideas about the painting as this immediate, intimate gesture were wrong, but that at the same time there was this way that that object could kind of overperform. It could. This is from a Fassbinder film called Martha, where she's been sunburned, but the makeup he uses is so over the top. It's extreme, and then in the painting, I'm not exaggerating it. I'm just transcribing that sense of. And you can see here clearly he's on the back and she's in the front, and so the painting kind of meets in the center where the support is. And that, to me, seemed like a reason why a painting could exist or could provoke some sort of strange, problematic relationship to an image. This was trying to move that onto canvas. It's, sections of the canvas are grounded and other sections aren't, and painted very thinly, trying to thematize that. And this, for instance, these are two paintings I made simultaneously as a kind of test. This is Hana Shigula. It's a canvas and it's a piece of mylar, and I mixed the same colors and did the same marks. I tried to make both paintings as kind of factum one, factum two, and let the materials really transform what the image was. So that's, I guess, a short way of saying that I arrived by about 2009 to this idea that what I was fascinated by with painting was this sense, it was the way that painting is pushed by its own ground, by the way that the format, the structure, the support, these types of things would interface with an image. And it's not about making that image, it's about making situations where these things are pushing somehow against each other. Drawing. I was the whole time also making these ink drawings. If I thought that the paintings were very intimate, I keep using that word, these ink drawings were meant to be very stagey. They were meant to be sort of I was really into mannerism. I love Bronzino quite a lot. And these were portraits. This was an East German actor who was billed as Belmondo of the East at the time. And I loved that name, and I loved that, this idea of trying to make these incredibly overcooked, refined, kind of precise mannered drawings in opposition to these paintings that were always chasing after a moving image that was getting away from you. But then I kept making these. That's Buster Keaton and his wife. Here's their relationship early on, and then it kind of turns into this later on. These are very small, and I started to get really disgusted with them because I felt like I was getting into that Sean Connery and Charlotte Rampling from Zardoz. The only way I knew how to push them was into this extreme campness, this over-the-topness, and I felt like the drawing was getting very slack because I was getting too sure of what I was doing each time, and they were actually getting mannered. And I sort of freaked out and decided I would try to set up an impossible project for myself. So I took this, the opening sequence of the first film that Udo Kier is a starring player in, is a film called Shamlos. It's kind of a Viennese exploitation film, and it starts with his face coming into focus with these aviator glasses. But it has the camera's out of focus, and these materials I was using couldn't do blur. So you couldn't do the Richter blur. You couldn't represent the optical focus. You had to think about what a drawing analog for out of focus would be. And I was thinking about the material what is that sequence? The sequence is 656 images that make that sequence. So I tried to draw each of those images. I basically set out to try to make more drawings than I thought I would ever be capable of making in terms of patience, and to try to draw in a way that it couldn't solve in the way that I would have solved it in a painting. I meant to show them like this. I framed up that batch of them, and I just thought that the grid was too, it seemed very, very familiar. So I ended up just packing them back together and making a film out of it. I just reconstituted the whole sequence, which meant that I basically had tricked myself into making an animation in which nothing happened, but the face came into focus. And I installed it this way. This was in Geneva, and it was this very narrow street, and I felt like I didn't want a kind of screening room experience of this work, because for me it was so much about this thing appearing. It was like this face coming out of a blank space, and so we showed it only at night, and it was very close to the windows. So it was this narrow street where you'd kind of suddenly be hit by this window, and by this face coming. That's the narrative I wanted to set up about drawing. It's drawing, trying to kind of push constantly through mishap, through fatigue, through process, trying to kind of undermine the sense of facility or habit in drawing. And good. That's 15 minutes, so I'm on track. This was a big moment for me, in that I was at the Paris airport and there was this pushy guy nudging around behind me in security who was really irritating. And at a certain point, I looked at, and that was his girlfriend, who was probably 20. And then I realized it was this guy, that this was Belmondo, actually, behind me at the security line in the airport. And I had just a couple months earlier had this experience of coming home in Berlin late at night and turning on the TV and seeing this film with him, in which it was a current film. He was melted. He was wearing a terrible Jewish outfit. It was a bad, made-for-TV procedural. And I was trying to capture that image because I had made drawings of Belmondo in his prime like this, and I was fascinated by those layers of mediation that were, basically I was a little drunk and I couldn't quite get the camera right, so it was, an out-of-focus, slightly oblique picture of a cheap television set with all of the television grain, of a bad costume and a terrible script with a lot of age of this icon. And I was just really fascinated by all of that and what that could be. Here he is on the plane chatting up the stewardesses. He was really great. But I had this photo in my studio for a long time and was fascinated by this photo, but couldn't figure out what could be done with that photo that wasn't actually making a Richter or a fake Richter, because there were all those qualities had been trapped into a sort of photographic idiom, and I thought there were ways to duplicate that, but I thought they'd been done somehow. And I finally decided to just do the cheesiest thing possible, which was to try to paint him and then paint the surface separately, to actually literally just paint the mediation, as it were. I made this painting, which you can see his face in there, I hope, somehow. His eye is in the top right. And this was an important thing for me because I was very fascinated with this object and the way that it functioned kind of cantankerously, that when you had a lot of light on it, you couldn't see anything. It would just become a silver square. And I picked the silver as a sort of non-color. I mean, obviously there's other associations with that too, but in the dark or from the side, his face appears more. And I was really fascinated by that, obviously that kind of quality of a painted object and its relationship with this image. And I made a bunch of these. I got very excited about this combination of materials, and also the stupidness of painting. The backside is oil paint, and then I would paint over it with white, so you couldn't cheat. There's no way to turn around and just look at the image. It's always embedded in the material somehow. And then the front, I was mixing calligraphy ink and putting it on. I mean, this is one of those pictures shot with a flash, so it looks like that, and then shot with sort of careful lighting, it looks like this. And it was a way for me to start making these portraits again that weren't mise-en-scenes from films. They weren't like captured films, but they were simply portraits of a kind of personage. This is an actress named here, Tilda Swinton from Egomania. Volker Spengler. You know, and basically I started following this vocabulary through shifting the way the format ran, and more the silver became kind of independent character in these pictures. It was not the blank square anymore. This is from Girls in Uniform, this film which I'll talk about in a second. And I was playing with the scale. What I liked about a picture like this was that way in which the painting, which was interference in the face, you know, the silver is a veil on the face, and we understand it that way. But then there is no oil paint under the body, so it changes its function in the middle of the painting from being interference to being form making. And I was very curious about that as a thought. Yeah, you see these started to get too fanciful as well. And I tried to work in sequence. This is Patrick McGowan. But the other thing which was really interesting about them to me was the way that they were unstable in some way. I was mixing the silver paint and I would mix it wrong. So this is actually a picture I took last month of that first Belmondo painting, which is rotting. And there was a way that silver yellows with time. It's not correct. I'm misusing the material. And it's pretty stable, but the ones of these that I liked the best were the ones that started to immediately fall apart. And I felt like that was this unexpected kind of collaboration that I would have with the surface that was then reasserting itself over top of my own attempts to control it. And that synced really well with what I was doing in drawing at the time, which I basically set out. I had found that, is everyone with me? Feel free to interrupt me, I'm just monologuing now. You know, the 650 drawings were too easy somehow. It was like it was very pleasurable. So I decided to try to make more that were governed by a different rule. And there's a story I'd thought about a lot of Aki Kaurismäki, this Finnish director who works often with the same, like many directors do, works often with the same actors. But his great actor was Matti Pelonpää, who's this guy, who died in his early 40s and has continued to be featured in all the Kaurismäki films, often as a still picture. You know, he'll be on the wall, and occasionally he's kind of worked into the narrative in a very quiet way. Like he'll be billed in the credits as the brother of the main character, and he appears as a picture on the mantelpiece. And I was very moved by that idea of that kind of the futility of that gesture, because of course what happens is all the other actors who you associate with him as a young man are now aging, and he's stuck as this still picture. Then there's a limited number of these things, and so I thought I would try to do a similar thing with him and try to bring him back to life by starting with a still image and making as many drawings as I could stand of that still image, which turned out to be 1,600, which actually I could have kept going, but I ran out of time. And I put them back into this. I was thinking a lot. I wanted to show this work with those silver paintings. I felt like this was the same line of thought about an image buried and trapped in its materials. And so I installed it in this way where you would encounter the film, and that's why it's a film, because it needed to have a physical, it needed to be made physical some way. You would encounter the projector, and you would see the image on the strip of celluloid, before you could see it projected. You were forced to, because it was on this wall with the paintings, and because nothing happens in the film except he sits there, it's stable enough that you can see it when it's going by. And so this was what I hoped your first experience would be, and then you could go and you could see this. And I'll play you, if I can figure out how to make it work, I'll play you just a short section of that. This is just a digital mock-up of, it was 2 projectors because I'd used 2 images, so there were 2 different batches, but nothing really happens. And I had a chance to show this again, and I felt like I had situated so much about painting and materials in the first show that I wanted it to be a film in the next showing of it, but needed the wall for the, for the projectors. So I thought, well, what I needed to do is kind of put up lobby cards. I need some sort of press packet that would occupy this wall, so something was there, so people would go up to the wall. And I had all these images of this actor I'd collected and made a kind of press pack of his life and thought about making an edition of it. But I didn't want to rephotograph them. That somehow felt like cheating. The camera seemed like extraneous to that process. And I didn't want to make drawings of them. And was just thinking, well, if I had the negatives, if I only had the negatives of these, I could make all these great 8x10 prints. And they could be standardized. So I just started fooling around just to see if I could draw the negative. And I started looking at a positive image and making this drawing on plastic. And then just took it to a friend who had a darkroom, and we made a contact print of it, and it made this image, which I was really, I was interested in two levels. One, I screwed up so much of the drawing. Things stay when you're working backwards that you would not let yourself leave if you were working forwards. And also, I realized I've been spending so much of my time struggling with this translation from a certain type of photographic surface into a kind of painted object that pushing the whole thing back and embedding the whole thing then into this photographic surface allowed the painting to stop being so, I don't know what the word is. Suddenly it could be almost more straightforward as painting. It was exciting. And at the same time, I was asked if I wanted to make a book, and I thought, no, I don't need a book. I don't have enough work to have a book. But I had just found this book that I really loved that was out of print. It was a biography of a German actress named Tate, who briefly, when she was 20, basically, she was cast in two films in 1931-32. One is Kula Vampa, which is the only film that Brecht made. And the other one is the original Girls in Uniform, not the Romy Schneider remake, but which is, an amazing all-women cast, central lesbian romance, boarding school film from Weimar, Germany. And these you see in the States all the time in kind of German film festival things. And when I moved to Germany, I expected her to be everywhere, and of course she's nowhere because she was in the left. She was very popular, she was blonde, she was, in a way, I could have been fined somehow if she had sold herself out, but she went to Switzerland in the 30s, and there was a law that if any Swiss woman wanted a role, she couldn't have, no foreigner could have the part. So she had to retrain as a psychiatric nurse. She did a little bit of acting, but barely, and worked much of her life as a nurse, and then came back to East Germany and started acting in her 60s. I love this story, and I was very fascinated by that gap, by that shift of the 20-year-old to the 60-year-old with nothing in between in the sort of public image, and had been collecting her image for a long time. And she was rediscovered simultaneously just before she died by two women from West Germany who were very interested in her as proto-lesbian cinema, like in that lineage. And then she was also found by somebody in East Germany who made a documentary called The Heart on the Left Side, all about what a staunch leftist she'd been. and there was this book that came out for the Berlin Film Festival, so I proposed basically to republish this book. But in thinking about, in trying to argue that case, I realized that I had made dozens of drawings and paintings of her over the years. And so what I ended up doing instead, as a kind of compromise, was scanning that whole book and just using it as a, so these are the PDFs of the thing I printed, but just using the book as a sort of scrapbook in which I could put my pictures in relationship to this thing, the place where I'd found that image with this combination. And as just the substrate in which these things would live, photographs of the paintings, etc. I was originally just going to show it in an empty gallery, but then that felt very precious, and then I realized that if you printed every page of the book A0, it would be exactly the circumference of the gallery. And something about that serendipity felt like it was the only thing to do. So I I printed the book and it wrapped the gallery, and then I used it to make a sort of third version of the book where I put all the objects I had that had her in them into this dialogue. And that basically is the beginning of the photo work that is at Liverpool, because I had just made those negative drawings, and I had this collection of Tila images, and I decided I was going to make the Tila photo archive, that I would take every picture I had of her and just try to draw the negatives so that I could have this binder of the complete photographic record of this woman's life, which would continue to grow. So I made a ton of these drawings, most of which were awful and didn't work, but they were just trying to translate all these pictures into the negatives. And then I made prints in different sizes of them from, well, you don't have a sense of scale here. A lot of these were contact prints, and they ranged, of course, from movie stills to pictures I had shot off the TV in, feverish appreciation. And, to these basically tons of images of this woman in all different ways. This is fantastic. Her as an older woman. And I realized I had this portrait gallery in a way, and so what I started to do, instead of making contact prints, I realized I could put these things between glass and just use them as large format negatives and scale them up to be essentially painting, and make these presentations of the project that were these kind of runs through the imagery, talking about my experience of looking for this person and the sort of generations of interest in her, and then new obscurity. She basically was discovered for about 2 months in the 80s, and then totally obscure again, and the book's out of print. But the last of I did a show of the work as a statements booth in the Basel Art Fair. And the week before the work was shipping, I tried to paint a portrait of one of the pictures that was leaving. I started making a painting with paint and silver ink of one of the pictures I just showed in actual size, and halfway through basically just changed horses and started making the painting in negative. And so this looked, in actuality, like all the silver pictures I showed you before, but then I made a contact print of that picture. And what was most fascinating to me about that was, again, this thing that was tripping up, which is that of course the white of the Mylar is white, and yet in the photo it disappears, but the white of the paint is white and the photo becomes white. So like the white and the black are both white in the original, and it's the middle tone that stays. And I, at the same time, having shown this work in Basel, got extremely annoyed by how often that story I just told you about Tila was being told. It was the selling pitch then, and it was somehow this thing, and I've just used it as a selling pitch to talk about the project too, but that anecdote I became very suspicious about. So I wanted to then go back and use these same materials with something which had no anecdote in some way. Of course, there was some anecdote. This is Asta Nielsen, who's the sort of inverse of Tila. If Tila is the obscure early German actress, Asta Nielsen is the big star of the silent era. And this is a photo that she had in her possession. It was a postcard that a friend of hers found at a train station in Russia and sent to her, saying, "Holy shit, you're so famous. You're here in the boonies. There's a postcard of you." And she kept that image of herself. And so I just thought about doing this show that would be only that image. And so I made it about maybe 15 or 16 paintings that look like the thing on the left, that I would then just contact print in a machine for exposing silk screens, those old vacuum press silk screen flatbed machines, to get the image, which is the image on the right, obviously. And I was working with a guy who had his own photo lab, and he was really precise. It's this amazing printer in Berlin who wouldn't make mistakes. And so I found myself that what I ended up doing was constantly trying to push the materials to make him angry. I was using these, I started mixing the paints that it would fall off when you moved, if you lifted the picture, it would start to flake off and break. This is a very thick paper towels. I would leave the tape on the picture and print that, and got deep into this strange thing of playing with those materials and how they kind of would function against each other and get transformed. And the show looked like this. I taped these things on the wall. I thought it should look like some kind of like mad Avedon studio of these tests of a portrait. And I hung some other work on top of it to try to make it feel less precious. And that was just before I did the show at the Renaissance Society, so that's not 2 years ago. And the thing that, I guess I'm staying true to my word, I'm just telling you all the things I was dissatisfied about. I hated that all the work was based on these stories of people. Every show was one character for a long time. And I wanted to make a show that was about my great interest and enthusiasm with this strange form that was sitting between these media and was surprising, that was constantly kind of undermining my own sense of owning it while I was making it. So I tried to do an eclectic cast show that pushed different ways of making these pictures. Just said, I'll do a show that's all black and white photography, but we'll find different ways to do it by hand. So this is a blow up. You know, this is from a small negative and it's just blown up, like the previous work. This is an extreme version of that. That's almost real scale. So that's thinking, okay, when you blow up these tiny marks from a drawing like this to that size, you're getting a cheap shot. It's like it's almost too easy to get these dramatic marks out of it. So let's pick this ridiculous dramatic image of Patrick McGowan, you know, surf beaten, and make this sort of movie banner. This was a nuclear physicist who accidentally irradiated himself, so I was trying to expose the picture with my cell phone. In the end, I sort of cheated. There was a flashlight for part of it. And then this was, I found at that time this kind of holy grail of Herta Thiele stuff in an East German TV archive, which was this interview she gave. The roles that she played later in her life were mostly non-speaking. She was always the sort of stooped neighbor next door, and that was part of the pathos of my whole experience with her. And then I found this interview where she is the most youthful person ever, and she has the same haircut she has where she's 20, and she's chain smoking and basically complaining that the East Germans have no idea what the hell to do with a woman. And it's this incredibly lively document, and so I tried to make these pictures that I thought of as the sort of television pictures, where I started sandwiching these materials from the paintings with these drawings and trying to make these very, what I thought it was kind of animated stills that are quite big. We'll get there. And this was shown alongside real animation. And unlike the other animations, which I had felt like I'd backed into through a drawing project, here I set out to make a film loop. I set out to try to make a show of paintings that to get to the show, you would have to walk through this projection of a video that would be all about movement and all about change, and all about a kind of relentless and unstable view of something. Here's a short clip. I can show you what that looks like. And I won't labor this because this was the first of a kind of family of these things, and I'll show you the most recent one instead. But you passed through that and would arrive at pictures like this, which I thought of as the pure portrait of the materials, trying to find different ways to make these pictures, making a drawing, and then when it's not quite dry, folding it in half so it becomes this sort of Rorschach, where parts of the drawing are different and parts are the same. You know, the ink is not quite set, so parts of it print off. Spray painting inside of a plastic bag and then printing that. I had, sitting around for a long time, this grid of Xeroxes that were taped together that was kind of a test for scaling up something that I thought I'd make a painting of, and I did it terribly and was always very fascinated about this strange out-of-syncness of this thing, so I just put a piece of plastic on it and traced all the dots of the Xerox like that, and then, you know, cut pieces of tape to exactly match the pieces of tape in the original, and tried to make a remake of this object, which looked like that. And then these pictures, I spray painted the background, that silver spray paint. And what I realized in doing that was that the big problem I was having was that all of these figures were floating in a kind of no space, that the ground would disappear. And my painting's been so interested in ground that that was the thing I'd lost. And I had this painting sitting around in my studio of Herta Tila. It's painted very thinly and very thickly. It's white. The white is very thick, and then she's very thinly painted. And I tried to make a contact print of that, which looked like this. The piece of paper I had was twice as big as the painting by accident, so I did it twice on the same sheet, just to, I felt like it needed to do that. And quickly really was interested in this and remade the painting to be double size and to be a negative, and got into this canvas picture. The surface of these things looks like that. And what I really was interested in with these is that a couple of things. One, the ground suddenly is a major player in the picture. And two, these unexpected differences come in the translation. Like the depth of field in the photograph is so much more sensitive than what we think of as a painting. So the most tautly stretched canvas still has these lines that are in focus and out of focus when you try to make a print, because the photo captures that difference. So the photo is more tuned somehow to the physical object than I was as a viewer. And I saw this happening and started to try to control this, to try to push parts of the picture while it was being developing or play around with shifting them. This was an attempt, I ran out of raw canvas and I used a primed canvas, and this, the exposure time for this image was about 3 hours, and in that time all those corrosive dots are tiny pinholes that were invisible. So that was this thing of these parts of the canvas that were invisible to me as the painter's eye, that became these apertures over the course of so much time to allow the light in, to start to create this other level of interference isn't really the word I would use, but of this, another character pops up in the whole conversation and looks like this. So that was a show, and the show was this. I mean, this, you can see I wanted to deploy these things in a big open flexible room where I could build the walls, treat the videos as wall works and not as moving image installation, and circulate through all these images and try to make what I was thinking of as an animation in architecture, in a way that these would be moving through an idea that was a linear idea in a way in the studio, and trying to kind of deploy it on a couple of axes with these moving image works. These are some of the other fragments of film, which I think in the interest of time I will gloss through, but you get a sense it was all these different pieces of things put together. There's this website I was looking at a lot at the time called Lost Film, which is a collaboration between a couple different national cinematochs that where you can post fragments of film that have been found that have not identified, and people try to identify them. And I was thinking of a kind of if my hard drive was all that was left at the end of the world, what would these fragments be, and how would they live together if they were kind of all that was there? If you, of course, then it also starts to look like an Oscars tribute reel as well. But putting all these things together, and the flashing is about the physicality of it. That when these things were running without the flash, they became cinema pictures in the wall, and everything else was a photo that was pinned right on the wall and was very immediate. And I felt like the space of the moving image was too recessive, and so in some ways I felt like it needed to constantly attack you physically. It needed to hit you, and it needed to do this. So that was the origin of this impulse to flip between the positive and negative, which then of course gets something of the rhythm of a film that's different from the rhythm of a video, and it kept that. No, I did too at that point. So I don't want to belabor this point, because now we're kind of into the photo work. But after that show, I started trying to do different things with this. This is painting on top of the pictures. So these are the next series of things I want to show you. I think of as moving through kind of a line of thought, trying to find my way through these things. These are painting on pictures. trying to use the spray paint can so that the spray gets into a difficult, almost trompe-l'oeil relationship with the things which are inside the image, trying to replicate some of the mark making that's inside of this photographic, some of the marks the light was making, not the marks that I was making, and try to copy those with spray, which was not entirely successful. Really, working with spray and acetone on top of a picture, pushing the murkiness, pushing the physicality of this fabric. This was at the time I was working on work for the Sharjah Biennial, and I was told I was going to have a space in the sort of in the Royal Portrait Gallery. So I thought that what I needed to do was make a group of work that was history painting and portraiture. And I thought of these things as people who, I thought it was kind of agents or movers or shakers. This is from Kulavampa. This is that East German actor I mentioned, Winfried Glatzeder. And you see that what's happening is I'm starting to try to get into different relationships with the fabric. I'm trying to let the ground speak more and more, or get pushed back, and try to think about this kind of dance between these different processes. This is a picture printed on one side, and this is the same picture printed the other side. So that difference in the fraction of a millimeter in the thickness of the canvas in relation to where the actual paint is makes a tremendous difference in the image itself. That's Asta Nielsen. And then, of course, the other thing is that this, when people saw these, they mistook these for being raster grids. They mistook these for being digital, this canvas quality, that the most basic woven linen became this kind of, actually is completely in dialogue with with the fabric of imagery now, or whatever. And I started seeking out linen that would have more digital types of patterns in it. This is a kind of, actually it's an ecclesiastical linen, I like to say. I got it from, it was for making church tablecloths, like kind of lace thing with this pattern, which is really extremely thin, and so the painting has to be very thin and the exposure is very short, and you end up with this very narrow range of contrast in this type of picture, which then, of course, has to be an interior scene because it gives a sort of surveillance feeling to the picture. This is two people in bed. This is Al Pacino from the Panic in Needle Park. That's also Al Pacino in the background there. I'll just go through these, actually. The thing that was ultimately dissatisfying then at that point is that I would do all this work and then I would print the damn thing. That you would then put it in chemicals and it would run its course. And so I started not preparing the chemicals. I started just putting it in a tray and pouring the chemicals so that the whole thing, I would work for weeks on these paintings and kind of prepare the plate, as it were. But then the actual thing happens in 45 seconds that are in and out of my control. And that felt like it was it reignited my interest in making these things on some level. That's the Death Mask of Robert Musil, the great author. This is, that's Thomas Mann, actually. It's a puzzle in the back of a magazine. Would guess this famous person based on the back of their head. So that's Thomas. I found it because this is Asta Nielsen, who was in this. But I was actually more interested in this Thomas Mann. It's got a great neck. And so this is basically the last 2 years. We're almost to date. Is that I had gotten into this vocabulary of these sort of picture paintings and would show them, in exhibitions along with continuations of the video. I'll show you a short clip of maybe this one. So this is a film that I made. Well, actually, I won't say much about it. It should kind of just make sense. This is just a small part of a 14-minute animation. So that was about relationships, I guess. But you can see there's a lot more, but I'll stop and go back. Just quickly showing you. This is in Los Angeles at Blum Poe. This is a shot of that film I just showed you, installed in Paris, in Marian Goodman's space there. And then the bicycles were down in the vault downstairs. I should just skip this part. This is at the same time I was doing this. I was running this space in Berlin with some friends, and in addition to all those gallery works, was spending most of my time doing these one-night events. We basically had this glass pavilion that used to be Josef Strauss space across from the Volksbühne, and so we had this idea of not doing exhibitions there, but doing these one-night events. So it was like this, actually Tacitus screening a film on the top. That's closing the windows for a film thing that Wally Beshti organized. It's me reading. Mel Bachner was the person teaching at Yale, and I got him to send me his notebook for a lecture he'd given, so I was trying to reconstruct this lecture based on his bullet point notes as I remembered it. And there's this quality of this idea of the work being sort of trying to be engaging and unstable and uncertain came out of this, my enthusiasm for doing this over being in the studio. This was a kiosk in Berlin where I took one of those paintings like I would make a photo print and put it in the kiosk, so at night when the light comes on, the whole thing kind of reveals its own transparency. On the flip side is the image that was made from that print, from that. And I just did this project at the Harvard Film Archive, where we showed this film in the cinema during the day, but over the course of the month, every 2 days, I changed all of the display boards. And so there's this quality of kind of trying to get out of this intense studio space and out of these kind of dramatic exhibitions into this type of presentation that was kind of parallel with a sense of trying to undo the images, find ways to do things the wrong way. And so this is, that's at Harvard. It's an installation of a little animation, and of course, what's interesting or exciting to me about it is this quality, is the way that this looks when you're actually at the screen, that physical quality of how that screen then becomes, I was using a stretched canvas and not a screen, so it became this physical object that had this relationship with this shifting image that led to these works, which are basically the last year, which are made in the same way. They're photograms from paintings, basically, but using the same painting now in sort of bigger sequences and playing and letting the photographic chemical qualities, trying to treat all of the things that go into making the photograph as just materials for working. This was here, actually. And these are pictures that were cut from Liverpool. So this is concurrent with that line of thought. I'm aware of the time, so I'm just going to go through these. I'm turning on the lights in the middle of things. That's what that is. That's what that is. And there's a street scene. One of these material pictures. And then this is this installation that was up at the Tate. I wanted to show a new moving image work, and I wanted to show it with the pictures. And the thing which has been driving me crazy for the last year is I've been missing color quite a lot and trying to find different ways to get this into the process. I actually have a whole pile of color tests which aren't right. The place where it was easy to get color in was in the animation. It was somehow very easy to draw with color on that scale. And I had been dissatisfied in the last little while with, I'd always put these moving images works with photos, but they were always separated somehow. Ever since the Renaissance Society, they were always in two different spaces. So the two things I knew I wanted to do in Liverpool were infuse the work with some kind of color and have these things in a space that was integrated and engaged. And those two things actually became the same problem, which is that I could make this animation that would have these passages of color that would refract around the room, and you could stand in front of one of these pictures and it would kind of colorize, and then it would go back to black and white. And you would move through these things. Basically you came in and there was a kind of broken plane. There was this wall with 4 of these pictures that was pushed, part of it was pushed back, and there were 2 pictures on the other wall. There's this shift between these big abstract pictures, which were much more present in this group of work. Yeah. So I'm going to end by showing you a section of that video, and which goes through passages like this and that. I have a lot of these, or that. But with it also were these pictures, which are sort of the first color photos I've made. These are, if you, I'm excited by this idea that these materials are no longer, black and white photography is really obsolete. And now I feel like it's all these rules can be broken somehow. Like this is basically a fixer problem, right? If you interrupt the development and then restart it, or put it in water which has a faint trace of fixer, it causes the blacks to shift into different colors and kind of do strange things, which is absolutely wrong. But what interests me then is that I started making a few of these pictures, and this is what I was doing in Berlin last week. I have a bunch of these I'm really excited about now. Where I'm trying to coax color out of these black and white things. Everything that goes into this is black and white, but then the picture itself is a color picture. And maybe I'm overly charmed by that, but there's something in that that's really interesting to me. And so these are sort of the pictures I kind of held on to in that show that feel like they're the start of something else. And then along with them, maybe what I can do is start this going, because I know that I've gone 20 minutes longer than I wanted. This is just a section of the film that was in Liverpool. We can talk over this if you'd like. I don't need to sit and watch. Or maybe this will hypnotize everyone so you won't ask me any questions. Maybe that's better. So, thank you. Please tell me all the things I forgot to talk about.
Okay, are there any questions? Leave it off, I guess. Yes, shouldn't stop people thinking.
Yes, that's a good question. And actually, I'm sorry, I left out the other thing I wanted to say was I didn't really describe the size of these things. I guess it was in the installation shots that these are all. The pictures that have canvas are all one-to-one contact prints, and so they're about this big. Those other pictures are going back to this idea of enlarging and shifting in that way. So those are, I'm making little drawings, and then I'm layering them on a light table to make other drawings for myself, and then making a print from that. So it's kind of like a 2-generation drawing, which is, I felt like the only way I could work with an abstraction in the first body of work was as a real blunt, like this is the material. Spray paint, here it is. And I wanted to come back to those pictures and have those as I wanted to develop that line of thought, but felt like I was too finicky about it, so I broke it into this process of making a ton of drawings and then like moving them around until I found things I liked and then blowing them up. So they're basically tiny little drawings on different, on like plastic sleeves that you put paper in because it resists the ink in a different way, and it scratches and it doesn't hold and is much more unstable than the mylar that I was using to make drawings. And so you have this these kind of 3 generations of different marks that are overlapping and kind of interfering with each other that then create difference that starts to create a picture. I don't know if they're basically little ink drawings that I'm putting between glass and scaling and trying to kind of pull these, you see things in them differently. Yeah.
Thanks. I very much liked your approach, the Mary Kelly one, of what is it, rather than what is the meaning.
Mm.
And I just wondered, there's another approach, which is to avoid anecdotes of production and meaning and intentionality, but to think about how you think the work's actually working.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder if you've got any thoughts about how you think the work works in the kind of contemporary context and in relation to the visitor to the space, how the exhibition works.
I have many hopes for that, but I'm not the sort of person that likes to project those, so I would never stand up and say that. So thank you for that question.
Yeah.
Definitely, I hope that things are perplexing, and the reason why I insist on showing the moving image work right now with the, sorry, maybe we should actually turn this off. This is your punishment. Is that it even goes back to that original thing of the painting that I just think that we are so deflective with our looking, and we're so quick to type things in genres, and it's in my power to stop this, actually. Bingo. That I found when I had an installation like in Sharjah that was just the photographs, they became one thing, and people came in and immediately decided how they were going to see that. And they immediately decided whether they're going to be interested in it being sort of painterly, whether they're going to see them as sort of something photographic that we don't understand. But they're actually quite indexical. They're quite matter of fact about what they are, and all that information's in there. And so my hope is that there's a certain way that you look at a picture on the wall, and there's a certain way that you look at a film that's challenging your ability to even perceive it, and that the experience of going from one to the other, like, I don't know, pitch the scab or something, that there's an experience of confusion and of, I hope also empowerment. I mean, there's two things that I think are really dangerous in my work that I really hate. And one is the anecdote that, especially when the work was really figurative and was straightforward painting, the question was, well, I don't know that film, so I can't understand it. And that's absolutely not what I want people to experience in this. These films just happen to be the things that I'm watching and interested about and spinning these narratives to myself about, but in a way that the whole project could be substituted with a different set of stories. So that's like that's a red herring. And then the other is technically, I want them to be puzzling and exciting as strange objects, but there's no solution, there's no profundity to the processes I'm using. I'm just constantly trying to fight against my own habits by trying to trip things up, and I'm excited about these photographs because I think that I hope they're in a space where people are puzzled by them and then try to trace through them or understand where the parts are sitting. So I mean, on some level that's not a profound social project, except that it basically grows out of, we love all these things in the world that we're experiencing, and that's not necessarily present in a lot of exhibitions that I see where there's a heavy-handed rhetoric of presentation, and so creating a kind of perplexing object in a difficult space is what I would hope the experience of the Liverpool show would be. The thing that I could say also clearly about that is that whenever I've installed one of the moving image works, I've always taken it to the space and changed I went through 14 edits at Marian's because the room was too dark and the projector was too good. And so the flash that had been right in my studio was just damaging in her space. And every day I took out more flash until there was much less of it in the film. And it's just trying to find this balance between a picture which is incredibly seductive and magnetic, and then yet off-putting, so that you're in this kind of tremulous relationship to that image and that surface, which is, I hope, what the experience of the photos would be too, that you can't quite look into it because you're too aware of something of the surface of the photo being there, or the tiny hairs that are across it, because I dusted the negative rather than cleaning it, or this type of thing. I don't know if that answered your question at all.
No,
but
it has.
Hi, I'm very interested in the relation between your investment in the images and your discussion of materiality and process, and what the relationship might be between the two, because when you talk about the images, who they are seems very important to you. And then they become sometimes something very abstract through process, and yet the sequence is a sequence of, in a sense, sequence of contacts, contact prints, or making a film photographically or whatever. There's a series of contacts by which the image that you're invested in becomes this kind of gains this emphasis on materiality. And it reminded me a little bit of, Parveen mentioned translation, but translation was also the word when, in the Middle Ages, one city stole the body of a saint from another city because they wanted to have a relic, and it was called translation, going from one place to another. And then it struck me, well, with a relic, the relic may start off as a recognizable body, but it doesn't necessarily end up that way. It may be totally unrecognizable. It may be some substance that you can't tell what it is. And I was wondering whether, one could apply that to your process of translation in some sense, that the material endpoint still has this almost relic relation to the image starting point, is achieved through a series of contacts of one kind or another. Would that make any sense in relation to how you see the work?
Yes, I think so, although I would flinch if I thought too much about it being a relic or a Shroud of Turin or this type of thing. But I think that contact is actually something it's something I'm very interested in, and maybe a way of answering that question is that I think that one of my most favorite texts, two actually, Jack Smith's text about Maria Montez, where he basically wrote about how good acting is watching something run really well like a smooth motor, and watching bad acting is experiencing something happening that you've never seen before. That was a really important thought to me. And then Fassbinder has this very beautiful thing he wrote when he was working on the Berlin Alexanderplatz, where he talked this very clearly about his experience of reading that book as a young teenager, as somebody in his 20s, somebody later, and that just trying to articulate that way in which the text is stable, but the thing that happens in the act of reading the text is completely transformative and different at the different points in his life, and that relationship to a kind of work or a precedent or work of literature makes me, I really believe in that, and to some extent I would say that maybe the way that would be my work would be this idea that I can start with these things I'm interested in, but the real thing I'm talking about is my contact with them and those places of experience which exist in time, and they exist in space, and then the exhibition exists in time and space, and it's very difficult to try to think about finding a way to work in your studio that would produce an object that would also have that loaded type of interaction, so that it's not about obscuring or even distilling or chopping up the image so much as just thinking that a straightforward presentation of this kind of inspirational figure for me, that's not really what it's about. It's about trying to kind of roll it and roll it and roll it until you have just there's something, and there's some moment that something got captured about that experience of touching it, that there's something about time that's very important in there. I guess that's...
Yeah, I think the question really came out of the sense that what you end up with is not like using photography as a pretext to create an abstract painting. It remains somehow invested in the end in a particular sort of very charged way.
And the photography brings a bunch of, in a way it's always working with photographic images, because I'm not talking about, that's the nature I'm talking about. The nature is this rewindable or VCR, VHS tapes. And there was always something wrong about starting with the photo and then trying to figure out a way to translate it into painting straightforwardly. That by picking up the photo materials, it was just like you could start to use them in the same way that you would use the painting, and it folds back into itself in an organic way, which I hope is not this contrived idea of sort of painterly photographs, but is actually just working at the intersection of these two vocabularies in a material way that is quite matter of fact and has no clear destination. It's, I guess, what it is.
I'll just call on myself, shall I? My impression when I saw the work was that, a very interesting synthesis of painting and photography, but very different from somebody like Richter, because I had the impression that the effect of your multiple processes is a kind of ruination, that the images kind of recede in some way, or get covered over with, the accidents that you talk about, and that somehow if the image is too straightforward, that it doesn't answer what you're looking for, which I found something to do with the ruination of the image, or it's maybe losing the image, almost losing it.
Yes, although I should say that I left out a lot of the really matter-of-fact ones, because where my head is right now is this chase for these color pictures, which are really buried inside of the materials. So I think when I was picking the pictures for this talk, I was thinking that that's what the show that I just did was full of, and I needed to draw that line. The Thomas Mann picture was another thought of matter-of-factness, of bluntness, of like moving exactly away from the murkiness. And so it's it can get cloying when there's too much, and I really have that sense of sometimes just trying to be very matter-of-fact, or very present.
Maybe it comes back to the idea of contact again, but I was thinking how, given the kind of ubiquity of Photoshop, whether you made a conscious decision to use analog methods to generate and manipulate images.
They were, quite simply, they're materials that can be used. You go to the paint store and you pick out things that are interesting to you, and you try to figure out how to work with them. So it was an approach that I felt like I could work with. The videos, the last two videos have sections that are very engaged with the inner workings of After Effects, because that's a material, and there's sets of functions and rules that work within there, and there's ways that those videos, the first ones could have been put together in a classic stop motion way because of the pacing, but I've tried to use the way that the program in After Effects organizes things to make a more splintered, jarring, jittery type of editing, that at the same time what's being depicted is much more literally material, that I'm using a scanner to scan graphite and ink and all these things, so I'm varying the actual materials that are making the image, but then also amping up the digital quality of them. And I don't think that that's resolved, but I don't think I'll touch Photoshop, because I have just been buying photo materials and giving myself cancer or something. But I am really interested in that. That's in the videos, in trying to bring the editing functions that I'm using in as kind of tripped up or matter-of-factly as everything else is, so that it's not an invisible part of the piece. So that if they're digital video, they have to be digital video. That it's as visible as the glossiness of the photo. Yeah. I don't know if that was your question.
Sorry, this is the last question.
It's really when early on you said about painting, there comes an idea when you have a notion of what the practice of painting is. And it seemed to me that that's a kind of helpful thing to say, because later on, I mean, I didn't think there was any problem of confusing the issue with something like Richter. It's clear that you're not, I mean, doing what he's doing, which is painting a photograph. You might be painting a photograph, but it has an entirely different signification. It means you're just putting paint on a photograph, as opposed to painting a photograph. I mean, in that sense, what seemed to me interesting is that there's a sort of prior abstraction in the work, where what you're really seeking to do at a conceptual level is see what painting and photography look like together, in a sense, in the kind of abstract sense of what you take them to be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as what people might call media.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I mean, all the stuff that's normally called, intermedial, whatever, it's, usually not the case at all. But actually, this is an attempt to, in some sense, make them work together, not on top of each other, or as conventions, but as the abstract summary of what the process is.
I hope. I mean, yes, we live in a photographic world, and I love painting a lot. So it's actually a very profoundly stupid idea.
I think we
Thank you,
let
everyone,
off
for all
now.
your attention.
Thank you very much
That was-
indeed.